Mark Rogers TV here to talk, of course, college football, the game that we love. In season, off season, we're always here to discuss college football. So I was in the midst of preparing videos for the weekend, including from Alabama, Iowa, Penn State, USC, and elsewhere, and saw the news just a few minutes ago of the passing of Keith Jackson at the age of 89. So I didn't prepare anything, but I thought it only fitting to pay some respects to the voice of college football. We all have our favorite play-by-play announcers if we watch a ton of sports, and in particular college football. I would do more than guess. I would almost guarantee that Keith Jackson was at the very top of that list for just about all of us who love college football. I was thinking about my son, who in particular is a big sports fan. And so Keith Jackson's final call was the famous Rose Bowl, Vince Young, 4th and 5 play to beat USC at the 2005 National Championship game, January of 2006 at the Rose Bowl. And Keith Jackson, of course, was on top of his game in maybe the greatest college football game in history. And I thought, I played it for my son and gave him a brief history of Keith Jackson and his greatness because he missed that era. He grows up in an era where the voices we remember, the voices we hear that resonate are opinion voices, the debate voices, the talking heads, the debate. And the play-by-play announcer is just, I don't want to diminish what they do because we have some fine, outstanding play-by-play guys working right now. Brad Nessler, Chris Fowler. There are certainly others that I find to be extremely good and not necessarily the guys that are considered to be the best or the guys that are considered to be the number one team for that particular network. Of course, Vern Lundquist just retired recently, and he has etched his spot in college football history as well. So I would like to invite anyone who would like to join us and give your comments concerning Keith Jackson. We can open it up to college football, but I wanted to focus on the legacy of the great Keith Jackson and share some of my thoughts as well. I need to pull up, since it went dormant on me here, need to pull up the comment feed from my channel. So hopefully that kicks in so I can see that as well. All right, so Keith Jackson, of course, calling that last game at the Rose Bowl with Vince Young. Dick Enberg just passed away, of course, a few weeks ago, who's most affiliated or associated for people my age or younger with the NFL and calling those great AFC games for NBC for the longest time when he really did his fine, best work, and then later with Dan Dierdorf with CBS. But Dick Enberg, Merlin Olsen spoke of Raiders, Chargers, Chiefs, Chargers, whoever the big teams were out west typically, and the great AFC matchups throughout the playoffs and the AFC championship game and a number of Super Bowls. But let's focus on Keith Jackson. And as I mentioned, it's just different, maybe not necessarily sad though, but the voices that resonate in sports right now, because we are just immersed with the talking head debate, and I certainly take part in it as well. So I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it's a bit overwhelming, and it's just changed throughout the years as opposed to when I grew up. The anchor guy in the studio, the anchor person in the studio, Brent Musburger on CBS doing the NFL Today, and then certainly the play-by-play voice And here we're talking about Keith Jackson. That was the paramount, that was the focus of broadcasting in sports. And we don't have that now. Typically, the analyst sitting next to the play-by-play guy, the analyst could be new to the profession. They could be new to not just the profession, but the craft of broadcasting, and be very rough. Typically, they're a former coach, a former player, sitting next to an accomplished play-by-play person who is lesser known. I know, again, in talking to the people that I talk to on a daily basis, outside of work, because inside work, people are very known, very knowledgeable about the play-by-play personalities and the studio anchor personalities. But in talking to fans, they now connect with the talking heads, the debate people, the opinion drivers, and then they secondly resonate with and connect with and remember the analysts. For me, it was the play-by-play guy. You go back to Keith Jackson, and he was the voice in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, almost to the end of the first decade of the 2000s, culminating with that Rose Bowl. I think about Keith Jackson, and of course, oh Nelly comes to mind. I heard him interviewed one time, at least one time, in which he mentioned that he couldn't really recount coming up with the term "oh Nelly," or didn't know how many times he had used it, if at all. I certainly believe that he did, and can think of the times that he did. But certainly the way he described a game, it was just so distinguished. It was so genuine. He wasn't just doing a job and doing a service, but he was fully ingrained in the atmosphere, in the vibe of the game. It was truly impressive to see and to hear, because he was so polished. And most broadcasters, and I was a traditional broadcaster at one time, you try to hone your craft. You try to be a polished broadcaster, because to broadcast live is not an easy thing, whether it's off script or on script or a combination, which is sometimes the most difficult, a combination of being on script and off script. The first aspect of broadcasting that most of us, and I went through broadcast journalism in college and in those early days, for myself and those, my peers around me, my friends, in trying to develop a style, even before developing a style, was just get the words out and try to sound professional and try to sound intelligible. And so Keith Jackson, for him to be that professional, but that genuine and homespun at the same time, I always was fascinated by his ability to be just a regular guy, to sound like a regular guy, to sound like the guy that you would want. Excuse me, calling a college football game that you would think, okay, this guy really, he's enjoying this. He wants to be there. He appreciates the game. He loves the game. And he's kind of just like me. He's a fan of the game, but at the same time, wow, listen to those pipes and listen to that delivery. It's like the Vin Scully of baseball. Just, there will never be another one like Keith Jackson. There are other very good ones. As we mentioned, Vern Ledquist recently retiring. Brad Nessler comes to mind, and Chris Fowler comes to mind. And there's a few guys out there. Wow, I'm not coming up with the names that I think are tremendous, that are maybe not the A team or the number one team on a particular network, that I think do a tremendous job. Joe Tessitore does a fine job as well. But man, Keith Jackson, when you think about the rivalries in college football. And of course, he was one man. He could only be at one game each week. But when Keith Jackson was at that game, you knew it was a big game. And for him to stay at one network, it's almost like players who stay with one team for the duration of their careers. A Terry Bradshaw, a Cal Ripken. There's just something a little more special. There's something a little bit more credible, a little bit more honorable about staying with one company, one organization for your entire career. Of course, he came up through the ranks, but once he reached the top at ABC, he was an ABC guy through and through, and called Olympics. He was, in fact, many don't know, the first voice of Monday Night Football in 1970, calling Jets Browns. And I apologize. I did no research on this, did no research on any of this. I saw the news a few minutes ago. I thought I'm going to jump on and pay my respects to Keith Jackson and hope to get some comments and some stories from you. But Keith Jackson did the very first Monday Night Football game, Jets Browns, back in 1970. Did it for one season, relinquished the play-by-play chores to Frank Gifford / Howard Cosell. League Championship Series. It was posted by Major League Baseball on Twitter. The 3 Reggie Jackson home run calls. Keith Jackson a bit drowned out by, I believe, Don Drysdale. And definitely Howard Cosell. But Keith Jackson, I remember as a huge baseball fan. The League Championship Series that he called, Houston, Philadelphia, 1980 and 86 were really good series. Of course, the Mets and the Astros in 1986. But in the late 70s and early 80s, Keith Jackson did a lot of Major League Baseball, Monday Night Baseball, and then into the playoffs and World Series. But it was always college football that Keith Jackson owned. And as I was starting to mention, he can only be in one place and one game each and every week. So you knew it had to be a big one. And maybe there was a bigger one on CBS or somewhere else. But for that ABC contract, he would have the game. I first remember him announcing with Frank Broyles in the late 70s. I started watching college football. The first college football game I remember was 1976. And I really started to watch more in 77, just some big games. And then by 1978, I was fully entrenched, just college football all day Saturday and statistics and just buried in college football starting in 1978. So for me, Keith Jackson and Frank Broyles, that was the team. That was the team to watch. I invite you, if you just want to listen to me rant, that's certainly fine. But if you would like to comment and leave any kind of any comments, any stories concerning Keith Jackson, I would love to hear those stories or those comments concerning the great voice of college football, Keith Jackson. Or if you have any questions or comments concerning college football, please join me on MarkRogersTV. If you're coming across my channel for the first time, please subscribe to me on YouTube. We have a lot of exciting things in store for 2018. We've recently talked to bloggers from Iowa, Penn State, Ohio State, USC, 2 from USC, bloggers and broadcasters both, and a bunch of other teams I'm forgetting right now, and have a number of other ones lined up. Alabama, of course, to discuss recapping 2017, talking about personnel losses and changes coming for 2018. Coaching changes, of course, not just the head coach, but coordinators and assistant coaches. Trying to track down my guy, Matt Moscona, with ESPN New Orleans and Baton Rouge to talk LSU, and Matt Canada to talk about their recruiting class as well. And so we've got a ton of content available on the channel right now, but coming in the next several days as well. I will be ranking the conferences 1 through 5 as well. to continue about Keith Jackson, again, from my own experience in listening to the Michigan Notre Dame games and the great rivalry games, those are the first ones that come to mind. And again, he could only be at one game at one time each week. So it just seems like he did them all, and he did eventually get to all of them, whichever was the biggest one on rivalry weekend. And back then it was Nebraska, Oklahoma, along with Ohio State, Michigan, Alabama, Auburn, USC, UCLA. Those are pretty much on Thanksgiving weekend. Those were the ones in the 70s and 80s. And Keith Jackson would he did them all multiple times. And of course, the Heisman call of Desmond Howard against Ohio State at the Big House in 1991. That one is all over social media this morning and this afternoon in honor of Keith Jackson, as well as the Vince Young call from the Rose Bowl in 2006. For those of us who do this for a living, and regardless of some of the comments I receive, yes, I have done this for a living for a number of years and have been in network television for a number of years. So I've been around a lot of great people and outstanding people from the time that I went through broadcast journalism in college, and then broadcasted for 11 years in traditional television. You always look to guys like Keith Jackson and think, okay, I want to be my own voice. I want to sound like me. I don't want to copy someone, but is there anything that I can take from what they do? I only did play-by-play sports for 3 to 4 years. And so that was never really a focus of mine. I looked at guys like the anchor types, the guys on SportsCenter, Brent Musburger, when he did way before. If you know Brent Musburger from the last 10 or 15 years, you don't know the Brent Musburger who nailed down, excuse my cold, the anchor desk at CBS for so many years for the NFL in particular. But those guys, Pat O'Brien, way back, Jim Nance, when he was in studio as well, were the guys that I tried to, again, not copy, because that's always a mistake of broadcasters, trying to copy the greats. Got to be your own man. You got to be yourself. Got to be your own person, and build your own style. But you can certainly take from their techniques and their approach and apply it. All right, those are basically my thoughts on Keith Jackson. Again, I remember the Frank Broyles team with Keith Jackson is what I believe to be the best. The salad days, as they call them. They called the Clemson Ohio State Gator Bowl game. What I found amusing about that, and I just watched that, I don't know, in the last year on YouTube, is just the confusion that ensued. The Woody Hayes punch on Charlie Ballman following the linebacker's interception of Art Schlechter to close out the Gator Bowl, because there was confusion as to whether, even though it was in plain sight and they had the replay, that Woody Hayes lifted the kid's headgear, and it was not a devastating punch, especially for a 250-pound linebacker or whatever he was. But that they were a bit confused as to the connection made or what transpired, possibly trying to protect old Woody just a bit, and what ended up being his final game. So that's just another example of Keith Jackson being there during one of the iconic moments in college football history. It was not a big game, but because it turned out to be the last game of one of the greatest coaches in history, it became a legendary game and a legendary call by Keith Jackson. I watched the intro of the 100th Ohio State-Michigan game from Ann Arbor in 2003, just a few minutes ago before I came on. Somebody had posted that to Twitter. And it wasn't just the play-by-play during the game, but it was the narrative before the game that Keith Jackson was so accomplished at executing, just to get you set, get you in the mood for the moment. and just it was almost NFL Films like. NFL Films, again, for many of you who might be a bit younger, NFL Films may have passed you by, but it made the action on the field poetic, warlike, just brought it to a theatrical level. And Keith Jackson's voice had the ability to do that during the game, but certainly scripted before the game. In speaking of a rivalry such as Ohio State, Michigan, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Alabama, Auburn at the Iron Bowl, I believe he called the Bo Jackson leap over the top of the Alabama Crimson Tide in 1982 as Auburn finally beat Alabama in Bear Bryant's final season. Somebody posted on Twitter an amusing, and I had forgotten about this, an amusing imitation Brett Favre made of Keith Jackson when he was mic'd during a game. I believe it was a game, maybe a practice, when Brett Favre had his arm around Keith Jackson, not the Keith Jackson whom we're honoring today, but Keith Jackson, the tight end who played at Oklahoma, who had many of his games called by Keith Jackson. I work with a Keith Jackson who sometimes will, amusingly, at least to us, give it the Keith Jackson voice. Oh, Nelly, let me tell you about Keith Jackson. So I just wanted to come on here. I didn't expect this to be anything eloquent, but just wanted to share my memories of Keith Jackson. Frank Broyles, Bob Greasy, of course, was his partner in the broadcast booth after that in the 80s, 90s. And then it was Dan Fouts in the later years, calling the championship games, most notably the game we keep referring to, his final game at the Rose Bowl for the national championship before the 1 year prior to the BCS. That might have factored into his retirement decision. I don't know. That ABC was losing the national championship games. They were going to the BCS format, and Fox taking over starting in 2006 with Florida, Ohio State. But yeah, Dan Fouts, and I'm sure there were a few other ones sprinkled in there, but they were the three main guys: Frank Broyles, Bob Greasy, and then Dan Fouts at the end of his career. And if there's somebody I'm missing, certainly remind me here. But I invite your comments concerning Keith Jackson or anything in college football. I want to do more of these because I think they're very effective, because as you can tell from my channel, I try to get to as many comments as possible. But this is the best way to do it in the moment, is to see your comments and your questions. And I can do those right now. I saw something pop up here just a second ago. Yeah, Danny Reich writes here that thanks, Mr. Jackson, for everything. You cannot be replaced. Rest in peace, my friend. Well stated. He won't be replaced. There are fine play-by-play announcers out there, but man, Keith Jackson, as I stated before, is the best I could. To be that polished and that genuine at the same time is a difficult combination to achieve. To be that homespun and genuine, but man, he was razor sharp, polished. I don't know that there was a word that ever came out of the man's mouth that wasn't measured. I don't mean measured in that he was that forward thinking about in a bad way to try to filter himself, but that wasn't just crisp and just on the mark. And again, I liken him in a way, even though they're very different broadcasters, I liken him to Vin Scully in baseball. Some people don't like his style. He was a bit subdued, but man, he was measured. He was on point, and it's difficult to do. It's difficult to broadcast live, as I am doing in a sense right now, and just be on point. Bob Costas is another one who is amazing. I used to be just, again, amazed at the conclusion of a big event, whether it be an NBA Final Series, World Series, championship football game, that Bob Costas would deliver a soliloquy at the conclusion that you thought had to be scripted. There is no way that he can give context to this event without any stammering or stumbling or ranting or missed words or trying to find his place. And he would just rip off a soliloquy that would conclude that event and just put it into plain view. Very impressive. Broadcasting is, as is any profession. To do it is not difficult. To do it to some degree takes a little bit of practice, a little bit of time, a little bit of effort, a little bit of thought. To do it to that level takes a lot of hard work, but it also takes an innate ability to do that, to think that quickly, just to be blessed with that type of voice as Keith Jackson was, and then just to be able to deliver it, to have the mindset, the brain working with the mouth, that fluently to cut loose in those moments. And the thing about Keith Jackson, he didn't say too much. He knew when to let the play and usually the aftermath of the play develop and unfold. And I don't know this for sure, but at one point there seemed to be a breakthrough in broadcasting in the play-by-play craft, that someone finally understood, let this moment breathe, shut up. People can hear the crowd. They can see the spectacle of this amazing play or the culmination of this event and the two coaches meeting at the center of the field or whatever the scene, that you can see it in Keith Jackson's calls. And I watched about 5 or 6 of them before I came on, that he knew when to be quiet and let the moment play out. He also was genius at delivering very short phrases. So it wasn't a bunch of rambling during a play, but he knew what one word to punch out. It would just be 1 or 2 words. Boom, boom, boom. And to be that concise in your communication as a broadcaster, so you're highlighting the event. You're letting the play out and giving it the stage and not talking over it or rambling through it, but you're also highlighting the high points or what this means in 1 word or 2 word spurts. And he did that like nobody else. It was amazing how he would be able to do that. Look at some of the old plays, the Desmond Howard play and the Vince Young play, and some of the plays at the conclusion of the Fiesta Bowl in 2003, Ohio State, Miami, the great Keith Jackson plays. Just look them up, and you're going to hear 1, 2, and 3 word outbursts that highlight the play, where he's not just rambling over the play. And I believe he was one of the first that understood his place when to talk, when not to talk, when to highlight something. And of course, the names that he put on different aspects of the game were just, the big uglies up front were just, again, homespun and true to himself. And to develop that kind of style is rare, and not just to be another generic play-by-play guy that gets the job done, does a fine job, calls it clean. But there's very few styles that really resonate with an audience over time. And Keith Jackson, of course, was able to accomplish that. I don't know off the top of my head when his career began. He's 89 years old. He was born in 1928. I know I've read through this years and years ago, but for me, it was a late 70s because of my age, getting into college football, and it was Keith Jackson. Brent Musburger, Ara Parsegan, for those of you that remember that CBS team that took over much of the Big Ten in the 1980s, they were a great team as well. Musburger and Parsegan were tremendous during that time as well. A young Jim Lampley used to be on the sideline for ABC during many of Keith Jackson's broadcasts, which is interesting to see now because then he evolved into a main sports anchor and then, of course, went into boxing. But a young Jim Lampley. Al Michaels, who, of course, is a great NFL announcer, once did Monday Night Football, now does the Sunday night games on NBC. He started with college football, and he was kind of ABC's number 2 guy for quite some time behind Keith Jackson's team with Frank Broyles and then Bob Greasy. And then Al Michaels got the Monday night gig, I believe, in 1985, following the retirement of Howard Cosell. And it was Michaels, Gifford, and Dan Deerdorf. All right. I'm diving into broadcasting all over the place. I could talk about this all day. Just wanted to get my thoughts on Keith Jackson. Rest in peace, Mr. Jackson. You were, and in many ways, because you have not been replaced, are the voice of college football. Please leave your comments. And for my overall channel, your questions, your suggestions, would love to hit the topics that you want me to hit on. For right now, I just thought it was apropos to honor Keith Jackson, the voice of college football.